Book 1, Chapter 1. How the city Jerusalem was taken, and the temple pillaged by Antiochus Epiphanes, as also concerning the actions of the Maccabees, Matthias, and Judas, and concerning the death of Judas, at the same time that Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, had a quarrel with the sixth Ptolemy about his right to the whole country of Syria. A great sedition fell among the men of power in Judea, and they had a contention about obtaining the government, while each of those that were of dignity could not endure to be subject to their equals. However, Onias, one of the high priests, got the better, and cast the sons of Tobias out of the city, who fled to Antiochus, and besought him to make use of them for his leaders, and to make an expedition into Judea. The king, being thereto disposed beforehand, complied with them, and came upon the Jews with a great army, and took their city by force, and slew a great multitude of those that favored Ptolemy, and sent out his soldiers to plunder them without mercy. He also spoiled the temple, and put a stop to the constant practice of offering a daily sacrifice of expiation for 3 years and 6 months. But Onias, the high priest, fled to Ptolemy, and received a place from him in the Nomus of Heliopolis, where he built a city resembling Jerusalem, and a temple that was like its temple, one concerning which we shall speak more in its proper place hereafter. Now Antiochus was not satisfied either with his unexpected taking the city, or with its pillage, or with the great slaughter he had made there, but being overcome with his violent passions, and remembering what he had suffered during the siege, he compelled the Jews to dissolve the laws of their country, and to keep their infants uncircumcised, and to sacrifice swine's flesh upon the altar, against which they all opposed themselves, and the most approved among them were put to death. Bacchides also, who was sent to keep the fortresses, having these wicked commands, joined to his own natural barbarity, indulged all sorts of the extremest wickedness, and tormented the worthiest of the inhabitants, man by man, and threatened their city every day with open destruction, till at length he provoked the poor sufferers by the extremity of his wicked doings to avenge themselves. Accordingly Matthias, the son of Azameneus, one of the priests who lived in a village called Modin, armed himself, together with his own family, which had 5 sons of his in it, and slew Bacchides with daggers, and thereupon, out of the fear of the many garrisons of the enemy, he fled to the mountains, and so many of the people followed him, that he was encouraged to come down from the mountains, and to give battle to Antiochus's generals, when he beat them, and drove them out of Judea. So he came to the government by this his success, and became the prince of his own people by their own free consent, and then died, leaving the government to Judas, his eldest son. Now Judas, supposing that Antiochus would not lie still, gathered an army out of his own countrymen, and was the first that made a league of friendship with the Romans, and drove Epiphanes out of the country, when he had made a second expedition into it, and this by giving him a great defeat there. And when he was warned by this great success, he made an assault upon the garrison that was in the city, for it had not been cut off hitherto. So he ejected them out of the upper city, and drove the soldiers into the lower, which part of the city was called the citadel. He then got the temple under his power, and cleansed the whole place, and walled it round about, and made new vessels for sacred ministrations, and brought them into the temple, because the former vessels had been profane. He also built another altar, and began to offer the sacrifices. And when the city had already received its sacred constitution, again Antiochus died, whose son Antiochus succeeded him in the kingdom, and in his hatred to the Jews also. So this Antiochus got together 50,000 footmen, and 5,000 horsemen, and 80 elephants, and marched through Judea into the mountainous parts. He then took Bethsura, which was a small city, but at a place called Bethsicaris, where the passage was narrow, Judas met him with his army. However, before the forces joined battle, Judas's brother Eleazar, seeing the very highest of the elephants adorned with a large tower, and with military trappings of gold to guard him, and supposing that Antiochus himself was upon him, he ran a great way before his own army, and cutting his way through the enemy's troops, he got up to the elephant, yet could he not reach him, who seemed to be the king, by reason of his being so high. But still he ran his weapon into the belly of the beast, and brought him down upon himself, and was crushed to death, having done no more than attempted great things, and showed that he preferred glory before life. Now he that governed the elephant was but a private man, and had he proved to be Antiochus, Eleazar had performed nothing more by this bold stroke than that it might appear he chose to die, when he had the bare hope of thereby doing a glorious action. Nay, this disappointment proved an omen to his brother Judas how the entire battle would end. It is true that the Jews fought it out bravely for a long time, but the king's forces, being superior in number, and having fortune on their side, obtained the victory. And when a great many of his men were slain, Judas took the rest with him, and fled to the toparchy of Gopna-Datar. So Antiochus went to Jerusalem, and stayed there but a few days, for he wanted provisions, and so he went his way. He left indeed a garrison behind him, such as he thought sufficient to keep the place, but drew the rest of his army off to take their winter quarters in Syria. Now, after the king was departed, Judas was not idle, for as many of his own nation came to him. So did he gather those that had escaped out of the battle together, and gave battle again to Antiochus's generals at a village called Adassa, and being too hard for his enemies in the battle, and killing a great number of them, he was at last himself slain also. Nor was it many days afterward that his brother John had a plot laid against him by Antiochus's party, and was slain by them. Book 1, Chapter 2. Concerning the successors of Judas, who were Jonathan and Simon, and John Hyrcanus. When Jonathan, who was Judas's brother, succeeded him, he behaved himself with great circumspection in other respects, with relation to his own people, and he corroborated his authority by preserving his friendship with the Romans. He also made a league with Antiochus the son. Yet was not all this sufficient for his security, for the tyrant Trypho, who was guardian to Antiochus's son, laid a plot against him, and besides that, endeavored to take off his friends, and caught Jonathan by a wile, as he was going to Ptolemais to Antiochus, with a few persons in his company, and put him in bonds, and then made an expedition against the Jews. But when he was afterward driven away by Simon, who was Jonathan's brother, and was enraged at his defeat, he put Jonathan to death. However, Simon managed the public affairs after a courageous manner, and took Gazara, and Joppa, and Jamnia, which were cities in his neighborhood. He also got the garrison under, and demolished the citadel. He was afterward an auxiliary to Antiochus against Trypho, whom he besieged in Dora, before he went on his expedition against the Medes. Yet could not he make the king ashamed of his ambition, though he had assisted him in killing Trypho. For it was not long ere Antiochus sent Cendebeus, his general, with an army to lay waste Judea, and to subdue Simon. Yet he, though he was now in years, conducted the war as if he were a much younger man. He also sent his sons with a band of strong men against Antiochus, while he took part of the army himself with him, and fell upon him from another quarter. He also laid a great many men in ambush in many places of the mountains, and was superior in all his attacks upon them. And when he had been conqueror after so glorious a manner, he was made high priest, and also freed the Jews from the dominion of the Macedonians, after 170 years of the empire of Seleucus. This Simon also had a plot laid against him, and was slain at a feast by his son-in-law Ptolemy, who put his wife and 2 sons into prison, and sent some persons to kill John, who was also called Hyrcanus, too. But when the young man was informed of their coming beforehand, he made haste to get to the city, as having a very great confidence in the people there, both on account of the memory of the glorious actions of his father, and of the hatred they could not but bear to the injustice of Ptolemy. Ptolemy also made an attempt to get into the city by another gate, but was repelled by the people, who had just then admitted of Hyrcanus. So he retired presently to one of the fortresses that were about Jericho, which was called Dagon. Now when Hyrcanus had received the high priesthood, which his father had held before, and had offered sacrifice to God, he made great haste to attack Ptolemy, that he might afford relief to his mother and brethren. So he laid siege to the fortress, and was superior to Ptolemy in other respects, but was overcome by him as to the just affection he had for his relation. For when Ptolemy was distressed, he brought forth his mother and his brethren, and set them upon the wall, and beat them with rods in everybody's sight, and threatened that unless he would go away immediately, he would throw them down headlong. At which sight Hyrcanus's commiseration and concern were too hard for his anger. But his mother was not dismayed, neither at the stripes she received, nor at the death with which she was threatened, but stretched out her hands, and prayed her son not to be moved with the injuries that she suffered, to spare the wretch, since it was to her better to die by the means of Ptolemy than to live ever so long, provided he might be punished for the injuries he done to their family. Now John's case was this: when he considered the courage of his mother, and heard her entreaty, he set about his attacks. But when he saw her beaten and torn to pieces with the stripes, he grew feeble, and was entirely overcome by his affections. And as the siege was delayed by this means, the year of rest came on, upon which the Jews rest every 7th year, as they do on every 7th day. On this year, therefore, Ptolemy was freed from being besieged, and slew the brethren of John with their mother, and fled to Zeno, who was also called Cotylas, who was tyrant of Philadelphia. And now Antiochus was so angry at what he had suffered from Simon, that he made an expedition into Judea, and sat down before Jerusalem, and besieged Hyrcanus. But Hyrcanus opened the sepulchre of David, who was the richest of all kings, and took thence about 3,000 talents in money, and induced Antiochus by the promise of 3,000 talents to raise the siege. Moreover, he was the first of the Jews that had money enough, and began to hire foreign auxiliaries also. However, at another time, when Antiochus was gone upon an expedition against the Medes, and so gave Hyrcanus an opportunity of being revenged upon him, he immediately made an attack upon the cities of Syria, as thinking, what proved to be the case with them, that he should find them empty of good troops. So he took Medaba and Samia, with the towns in their neighborhood, as also Shechem and Gerizim. And besides these, he subdued the nation of the Cuthians, who dwelt round about that temple which was built in imitation of the temple at Jerusalem. He also took a great many other cities of Idumea, with Adorian and Marissa. He also proceeded as far as Samaria, where is now the city Sebast, which was built by Herod the king, and encompassed it all round with a wall, and set his sons, Aristobulus and Antigonus, over the siege, who pushed it on so hard that a famine so far prevailed within the city that they were forced to eat what never was esteemed food. They also invited Antiochus, who was called Cyzicenus, to come to their assistance, whereupon he got ready and complied with their invitation, but was beaten by Aristobulus and Antigonus, and indeed he was pursued as far as Scythopolis by these brethren, and fled away from them. So they returned back to Samaria, and shut the multitude again within the wall. And when they had taken the city, they demolished it, and made slaves of its inhabitants. And as they had still great success in their undertaking, they did not suffer their zeal to cool, but marched with an army as far as Scythopolis, and made an incursion upon it, and laid waste all the country that lay within Mount Carmel. But then these successes of John and of his sons made them be envied, and occasioned a sedition in the country, and many there were who got together, and would not be at rest till they brake out into open war, in which war they were beaten. So John lived the rest of his life very happily, and administered the government after a most extraordinary manner, and this for 33 entire years together. He died, leaving 5 sons behind him. He was certainly a very happy man, and afforded no occasion to have any complaint made of fortune on his account. He it was who alone had 3 of the most desirable things in the world: the government of his nation, and the high priesthood, and the gift of prophecy. For the deity conversed with him, and he was not ignorant of anything that was to come afterward, insomuch that he foresaw and foretold that his 2 eldest sons would not continue masters of the government. And it will highly deserve our narration to describe their catastrophe, and how far inferior these men were to their father in felicity. Chapter 3. How Aristobulus was the first that put a diadem about his head, and after he had put his mother and brother to death, died himself, when he had reigned no more than a year. For after the death of their father, the elder of them, Aristobulus, changed the government into a kingdom, and was the first that put a diadem upon his head, 471 years, and 3 months after our people came down into this country, when they were set free from the Babylonian slavery. Now, of his brethren, he appeared to have an affection for Antigonus, who was next to him, and made him his equal. But for the rest, he bound them and put them in prison. He also put his mother in bonds, for her contesting the government with him, for John had left her to be the governess of public affairs. He also proceeded to that degree of barbarity as to cause her to be pined to death in prison. 2. But vengeance circumvented him in the affair of his brother Antigonus, whom he loved and whom he made his partner in the kingdom. For he slew him by the means of the calumnies which ill men about the palace contrived against him. At first, indeed, Aristobulus would not believe their reports, partly out of the affection he had for his brother, and partly because he thought that a great part of these tales were owing to the envy of their relators. However, as Antigonus came once in a splendid manner from the army to that festival, wherein our ancient custom is to make tabernacles for God, it happened in those days that Aristobulus was sick, and that, at the conclusion of the feast, Antigonus came up to it, with his armed men about him, and this, when he was adorned in the finest manner possible, and that, in a great measure, to pray to God on the behalf of his brother. Now, at this very time, it was that these ill men came to the king, and told him in what a pompous manner the armed men came, and with what insolence Antigonus marched, and that such his insolence was too great for a private person, and that accordingly he was come with a great band of men to kill him, for that he could not endure this bare enjoyment of royal honor, when it was in his power to take the kingdom himself. Now Aristobulus, by degrees and unwillingly, gave credit to these accusations, and accordingly he took care not to discover his suspicion openly, though he provided to be secure against any accidents. So he placed the guards of his body in a certain dark subterranean passage, for he lay sick in a place called formerly the Citadel, though afterwards its name was changed to Antonia. And he gave orders that if Antigonus came unarmed, they should let him alone, but if he came to him in his armor, they should kill him. He also sent some to let him know beforehand that he should come unarmed. But upon this occasion the queen very cunningly contrived the matter with those that plotted his ruin. For she persuaded those that were sent to conceal the king's message, but to tell Antigonus how his brother had heard he had got a very the suit of armor, made with fine martial ornaments, in Galilee, and because his present sickness hindered him from coming and seeing all that finery, he very much desired to see him now in his armor, because, said he, in a little time thou art going away from me. As soon as Antigonus heard this, the good temper of his brother not allowing him to suspect any harm from him, he came along with his armor on, to show it to his brother. But when he was going along that dark passage which was called Strato's Tower, he was slain by the bodyguards, and became an eminent instance how calumny destroys all goodwill and natural affection, and how none of our good affections are strong enough to resist envy perpetually. 5. And truly anyone would be surprised at Judas upon this occasion. He was of the sect of the Essens, and had never failed or deceived men in his predictions before. Now this man saw Antigonus as he was passing along by the temple, and cried out to his acquaintance. They were not a few who attended upon him as his scholars, O strange. Said he, It is good for me to die now, since truth is dead before me, and somewhat that I have foretold hath proved false. For this Antigonus is this day alive, who ought to have died this day, and the place where he ought to be slain, according to that fatal decree, was Strato's Tower, which is at the distance of 600 furlongs from this place, and yet 4 hours of this day are over already, which point of time renders the prediction impossible to be filled. And when the old man had said this, he was dejected in his mind, and so continued. But in a little time news came that Antigonus was slain in a subterraneous place, which was itself also called Strato's Tower, by the same name with that Caesarea which lay by the seaside. And this ambiguity it was which caused the prophet's disorder. Hereupon Aristobulus repented of the great crime he had been guilty of, and this gave occasion to the increase of his distemper. He also grew worse and worse, and his soul was constantly disturbed at the thoughts of what he had done, till his very bowels, being torn to pieces by the intolerable grief he was under, he threw up a great quantity of blood, and as one of those servants that attended him carried out that blood, he, by some supernatural providence, slipped and fell down in the very place where Antigonus had been slain. And so he spilt some of the murderer's blood upon the spots of the blood of him that had been murdered, which still appeared. Hereupon a lamentable cry arose among the spectators, as if the servant had spilled the blood on purpose in that place. And as the king heard that cry, he inquired what was the cause of it, and while nobody durst tell him, he pressed them so much the more to let him know what was the matter. So at length, when he had threatened them, and forced them to speak out, they told, whereupon he burst into tears, and groaned, and said, So, I perceive I am not like to escape the all-seeing eye of God, as to the great crimes I have committed, but the vengeance of the blood of my kinsman pursues me hastily. O thou most impudent body, how long wilt thou retain in a soul that ought to die on account of that punishment it ought to suffer for a mother and a brother slain? How long shall I myself spend my blood drop by drop? Let them take it all at once, and let their ghosts no longer be disappointed by a few parcels of my bowels offered to them. As soon as he had said these words, he presently died, when he had reigned longer than a year.